So, 3 extraordinary debut graphic novels. Now, these 3 have a lot in common. They present their world in a really interesting way. They tell me something about the real world and about the imagined world that I kind of found interesting and may not have even known in the first place. And they're all debut graphic novels. Now, there's one codicil because one of the authors is a pretty well-established artist across the pond and across the Atlantic. And I think he had brought out some children's books before, but I'm not counting that. I'm counting kind of graphic novel, memoir type thing, and I'm including him here because I was really taken aback by how good and how great and interesting the book was. I'll start with the British authors first. Toussaint Louverture, the story of the only successful slave revolt in history, adapted by Nick Watts and Skira Karimji. I think I'm pronouncing that right, I have no idea. And as far as I know, this is Nick Watts' first graphic novel. I'm not too sure about his co-adapter, but this really just blew me away on every level. Those who have watched the channel before know that my stock and trade in life is a historian. I am a historian. And so that's why I tend to gravitate more to kind of historical non-fiction novels that tell the story about the past in an interesting way. And I always wax lyrical about how good graphic novel as a format is in imparting historical tales and narratives. And this is no exception. What changes this massively, though, is the name at the top, C.L.R. James, a historian that really changed everything in many ways when he published work back in the early to mid 20th century. And yeah, he really did revolutionize how we viewed certain aspects of the past, namely the slave rebellion and slave revolt in Saint-Dominique and what we call now modern day Haiti. C.L.R. James has published lots of books. The most notable probably is Black Jacobins, which is a phenomenal book that documents the story of this slave revolt, focusing on Toussaint Louverture, who became this really centerpiece for the whole movement and for the whole kind of revolt. And he became, a general and a commander in the revolt. This is different though in many ways because this is an adaptation of a screenplay that was created by James back in the mid 20th century for a stage performance with the theme of the slave revolt in Haiti. And yeah, and apparently according to the back, Paul Robeson was the title role of Toussaint Louverture in 1936, and black actors and a black cast appeared for the first time properly, really, as leads on a British stage in this play. And the screenplay was lost or thought to be lost for many years, and it was discovered and rediscovered and adapted here. So the presentation of this story is very different from other versions of the story that you'll find. Obviously, it's a graphic novel presentation, but what I mean more than anything is that if you've ever been to see a play, they often have, as few as possible set changes and scene changes because it's a great effort and a lot of work to kind of constantly change over the backdrop and the scene. And so the screenplay laser focuses on a few pivotal moments in the slave revolt. You may think as well, it's a kind of biographical story about Toussaint Louverture, but it's really not. It's about the revolt. So it jumps in and out of following him, and it follows the story of the revolt itself. So whatever scenes and whatever historical narratives change the format and structure of the revolt, that's what it focuses on. It doesn't focus on the pivotal changing points in his life or in any one person's life necessarily. It focuses on the revolt itself and how that changed and adapted and the major changing points of the revolt itself. So it starts off with the island being taken, then it jumps into kind of the next portion where the revolt changes pace, then again and again, and it jumps over the Atlantic into France and Paris. You will start this book and you will instantly think, if you were used to reading graphic novels and things like that It's very text heavy, but it's written in such a beautifully flowing way. And again, James will take credit for that, as well as the people who adapted it, because I haven't seen the original script. I don't know how much they adapted and changed certain elements, but either way, the dialogue in it, even though it looks like it's quite dialogue heavy and wordy, it reads so well that it's really a very quick read, considering how big a book it is and how detailed it is and how packed with text it is. I read it really quickly. I was kind of enthralled and taken aback by it. And I think it's a lot to do with the fact that it is focusing on these dialogue heavy scenes where one side or two or three or four sides are discussing the whole situation between themselves. And so there's a fast kind of frenetic pace between the conversations. The artwork of Nick Watts, all black and white, is kind of sketchy pencil-like artwork. And it's phenomenal because all the characters in it are very unique. You never really get confused about who's who, but you will get confused about their role in the whole affair and where they stand in their own country's government or their army or that type of thing. That's why the beginning has a really helpful, character overview. It gives you a little snippet and tells you their name and their role in the story. So if you do need a reference point, it's there, because trust me, there are an astounding amount of people involved in this story, as you would expect, really. The artwork throughout, though, genuinely is super detailed, super historically accurate in many ways, but then very kind of caricature-like. Those people who are quite extreme characters, quite negative, nasty characters, the words they're saying are horrible, and then their faces and dress and hair are all designed to really annoy you even more, to be fair. And then the more moderate people are quite restrained and respectful, and the slaves are scar-ridden, and there's a lot of really great characterization going on. But then the architecture and the style, when he's drawing Paris, when he's drawing these tropical islands, it's just great. Honestly, art-wise, I love this book because, again, it does exactly what I want from graphic novels. It's really interesting, artistically detailed, and it's full of emotion, and you're never confused about what a person is feeling. There's no ambiguity, and that's one of the things I love about graphic novels, really, is that having the art there, you have the ability to really ram home exactly what that person is feeling. The whole narrative of this slave revolt is amazing because essentially James is reframing of this revolt in terms of this French community has been influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity. They've taken on the teachings of the country that's colonized them and that's taken over their lives, really. And then they've looked at themselves and gone, well, we want that as well. We want what our country is telling us, and so we are going to stick up for those ideals. And then it gets to the point where the French realise what they've done is they politicised the enslaved people of these various colonies, and now they are almost kind of adapting these lessons to suit their own kind of view of the world. Like, they disagree with some of the stuff like the revolution did in France, and so they take some bits and then don't take others. And that is the key bit, I think, to understand in this whole story, is they taking a lot of the narrative and learning from it, but then they're making it their own. And that is where the lines get all pulled apart, because, the French forces don't want this incredibly lucrative colony flying off on their own. The English doesn't want it, the Spanish doesn't want it. All these colonial kind of powers want to force these people into a place where it best suits them, but they don't want to. They want their freedom, they want their space, they want their lives. And it's a really fascinating story, adapted beautifully. There's some really innovative page layout as well to showcase the mental state of characters and the excessive kind of torture and pain and anguish and happiness. The page kind of almost gets kind of abstract in many cases, and yeah, there's loads to love about this book, I think, particularly if you like 18th and 19th century history. This is a real great read, and I would highly recommend it, definitely. Next up, Your Wish is My Command by Dina Muhammad, and it's read from right to left like a manga because Arabic is written in that way as well. This I loved for so many different reasons, but I'll start with the main reason that I fell in love with it. It's because it modernized and changed a very familiar story and narrative, namely the fact that wishing and 3 wishes and, you know, all this kind of Arabian Nights type of mentality and fantasy. It takes that idea and changes it into almost like a weird kind of science fiction tale in a weird way, but then it grounds it in a gigantic amount of realism and emotion. But the whole concept was what intrigued me first and foremost, that it's set in a world the wishes are real. And they're not just real, they don't only come from lamps, but they can be mined, they can be bottled, they can be sold, and there's different classes of wishes as well. So there's first class, second class, third class wishes, and there are a ton of reasons why there's these different classes of wishes, but I'll leave you find that out yourselves. And so wishing is a reality, but there's different tiers of wishing. And it's set in Cairo in Egypt, and the world around it has grown up with the wealthy trying to exploit these wishes and trying to make sure that they get all the really good wishes for themselves, you know, the first class wishes, and leave the working classes and middle classes have the other wishes there. But it focuses in on a kiosk seller who is a little down on his luck, a little lost financially, and his father has given him 3 first class wishes. But because of his religion, he's never used them and never thought it was appropriate to use them, because his father was very religious, so was he, and so they decided, no, it's not proper to use those wishes. But then he thinks, I need the money, I'm going to sell them. So he puts a sign up and he basically offers the wishes for sale. And so this book is split up into 3 sections, and each section is the story of what happens with one of the wishes this kiosk seller sells. The book starts off in colour, and honestly, the artwork just, I thought was great. It was, again, like the last book, full of emotion, full of character, full of uniqueness within the characters. You're never getting confused as to who's who, where's where, what's what. It's all really drawn so vividly and well. The story of each wish being sold then reverts to black and white, so you kind of almost have these definitive lines and borders to when you know you are finding out about the story of what happened to that wish that the kiosk seller is selling. The first story is of Azia, and Azia essentially is a story all about a lady going through extreme grief and then finding that wish and trying to use it to alleviate some of her grief. But then she gets caught in a bureaucratic state that has almost kind of eradicated the possibility of normal people, working class normal people, using wishes of the first class nature. And so she gets sucked into this bureaucracy, but she's adamant that she wants to use this wish to help alleviate her grief in some way. It's an amazing opening story because ultimately you were met with this woman who's really restrained, really kind of restricted in her own life, but she felt happiness in the company of the person she lost, and she just wants to try and salvage something out of that grief and loss. And so this kiosk seller is selling a wish. She works for years trying to earn money to buy this wish, and only to find that she gets sucked into this bureaucracy, and it changes the whole story, because the story starts off as one of grief, then one of kind of massive effort to try and get this wish, then one of absolute frustration and disappointment, and it goes to places that you don't see, and it is an exceptional opener, I think. The second story then focuses on a teenager that's depressed, a very wealthy teenager that wants to use wishes to kind of change their lives in many ways and to try and alter it. Now, on the surface, coming from the first story into the second, when you start reading it, you kind of like, you're not as into the story, you're not as linked to it. But then as it goes on and as you start continue reading it, you find a lot to like and a lot to be invested in the character that's following, and you really get into the mindset of what the story is fundamentally about. And it's all about kind of lack of self-esteem, depression, being young, being in this world, and having wishes there to kind of almost be like an ejector seat from all this pain. And the first and the second story showcase beautifully as well, as does the third. The wishes however much you think they're going to alter the world, however much they think they're going to change stuff, they don't fundamentally alter the basics of humanity, really. And that's a great thread that goes through the whole book. The third book focuses on the kiosk seller trying to give the wish to someone that he wants to save the life of, and then only realizing that it's nowhere near as straightforward as he would think, really. And dotted throughout this book, you get much more immersive details about the world, about how wishes work, about how they mind, about how they're used, about the problems and atrocities that they've been used for over the years. And in different points, you get like talking animals coming in, dinosaurs, you know, big kaiju monsters. It's an amazing world that this author has created, really. But equally, it is super full of humanity and emotion and humanity that everyone will be able to get on the first read, really. That it is about humans being given something that they think will solve every problem, but all it does is create other problems, and it'll never really fundamentally help them in the way they think it will. But I loved this book. Artwork, story, creativity, imagination. It was great. The final book is by Adele Rodriguez. It's called Worm, A Cuban-American Odyssey. This is the author that it may not be his debut, but I'm going to count it as his debut, even though, because a few of the others don't really fit my definition, maybe I'll put it like that, of a graphic novel. This is certainly his debut graphic memoir, if we want to call it that. This was one of the books I was most looking forward to because the art style looked so intriguing to me. I knew it was about Cuba and about kind of 1950s, 60s, 70s Cuba, and I loved how the artwork was so kind of colour palette wise in tune with that setting, you know, lots of reds, greens, blacks. Artistically, it dragged me in because there isn't another book that I've seen that's like it, really. The art style, the colouring, the layout, the everything. And then I started reading it and I realised just how significantly interesting and fascinating this book is. So art-wise, it's fantastic throughout and so innovative and creative in its use of colour and style and everything. I really enjoyed the artwork throughout. But the story is really what pushed this book into another stratosphere for me in terms of enjoyment. First and foremost, it's a non-fiction biography of the author Adele Rodriguez. He was born in 1971 in Cuba. This tells the story of him, his mother, his father and his sister leaving Cuba and coming to America in 1980. But it tells so much more story about American culture and about Cuban culture and life in those two countries in this kind of 1980s, 90s and right the way through to the modern times, really. It does go right the way up to modern times. So it starts off with Fidel Castro taking over and the revolution kind of taking hold and then communism reigning supreme on the island. But instantly, the way it lays it down, it talks to you as a person who experienced it. As the mom, the dad, the son and the daughter that experienced it. It tells you that lofty kind of, you know, the revolution happened and all that, but it tells you exactly what that meant to these people in terms of, you know, how it affected what they ate, what they drank, how they had to queue up for a toy, you know, once a year and then hopefully get the best toy, how everything was restricted, how everything was limited, but then how lots of people were trying to work the system, and a very different type of Cuba comes across in this text, I think, from what you would read in your typical kind of historical narrative or on a historical documentary. It's really hyper personal, and that is what I loved most about it, is there's no room for kind of, you know, historical referencing or anything like that. This is a family story and it's told in their first-hand account. You know, it's not watering anything down, it's not making anything more nasty, it's not making anything more happy, it's just the bare bones. So it tells you about how horrendous it was to live in this kind of unsanitary situation where everything was quite restrictive. But then equally it tells you about how Adele in particular is just fascinated and enthralled and comforted by the stories his grandmother would tell him about their culture and past, about going into the sugarcane fields and sucking on the raw sugarcane and things like that, and playing and constantly kind of out and about. But then equally it tells you about his sister going to school and having to kind of leave home for like 40 days or something and do these intensive farming and educational sessions. Really horrible in every way. It tells you about all the highs, all the lows, and every single thing in between. And it builds to a point where the parents feel that they have to get out of Cuba because the way they live their lives is bringing attention, because there's lots of people being snitches, telling people and telling government organisations. And that's one of the things, actually, is like, you know, you don't give credit that there was people living on practically every street in every town who were paid to spy on their neighbours and then relay the information back to central government to make sure that everyone was equal, that no one was taking advantage, no one was taking abuse. And so you constantly checking what you're saying, not trusting people, not having all the what you feel you might want. And yeah, it's a really difficult environment to actually explain and understand. But Adele Rodriguez, in his family's experiences, put it out, visualize it, and put the narrative there perfectly, so you really understand what it is to be like in that community. And an opportunity comes up when basically certain members of Cuban society want to get out, and so they take over an embassy, and basically Castro wants to get rid of them and get shot of them, as well as all the people from the prisons and all the people who are gay and loads of other things. They broker this deal with America and other places to get rid of these people on boats. And so this story builds to that leaving of the country and then going to a new country. But it's nowhere near as straightforward as that. And that's one of the absolutely beautiful things about this book, is that the family and the people set up around him and the people who have already left to America in years prior to him being born all come together, and with love and kind of passion and just sheer force of will, try to save their family from Cuba and bring them to America to try and reinvigorate and restart their lives and give them opportunity. And it's amazing how you build quite a negative experience of the communist kind of regime in Cuba, but then equally you're constantly reminded that these people are just so wonderful in the amount of love and support that they've got for each other. And that came across beautifully, how family really saved Adele's life and really give him a new life. The book builds and builds and builds, and the majority of the book is his experiences in Cuba, you know, living, playing, getting ill, getting well, going to school, and then building towards the eventual kind of boat trip over to America, and then getting to America, how this Cuban boy then lives in America, becomes an artist, features on the front cover of Time magazine, and then eventually he brings parallels with how Trump America is kind of close to what he experienced in Cuba, in communist Cuba, in terms of the rhetoric and the style of life and all that type of thing. It's a fascinating read. It really is an absolutely phenomenal read. It's one of the most enjoyable biographies I've ever read, and it certainly taught me more than any other book I've ever read about communist Cuba, because he was so hyper-focused on the personal experience. And to me, I learned far better when I kind of hyper-focus on things rather than getting broad strokes. But this is a fantastic book, this is. All three of them are, actually. So I hope you've enjoyed having a look at all three of these debut graphic novels with me. Definitely check all three of them out if you get a chance. Thank you very much for watching. I will catch you on the next one.